Did you know that the world's 8 richest men own as much wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion people combined? It's a gap so wide it feels impossible to bridge. But today, we're going to look at what happens when that wealth meets something it can't buy. Pure, unadulterated genius. This is the story of Elias Vance, a young man who went from the freezing, oil-slicked floors of a shipyard to the most exclusive lecture hall in the world, where he faced a man who thought he was a god. Imagine the scene. The Sterling Institute. A room filled with the sons and daughters of oil tycoons and tech giants. At the front of the room stands Julian Sterling, a man worth $40 billion, holding a piece of chalk like a scepter. He looks at Elias, the only student in a faded hoodie, and sneers. He scrawls an equation on the board that has baffled the greatest minds for a decade. "Mr. Vance," Sterling says, his voice dripping with icy contempt. "You have 5 minutes to solve this. If you can't, your scholarship is revoked. You'll be back at the shipyard by sunset. Start now." The digital clock on the wall begins its red, rhythmic countdown. 4:59. 4:58. The silence in the room is heavy enough to crush a man. Elias looks at the board, and for a second he doesn't move. The billionaire smiles, thinking he's finally won. But to understand why this moment matters, we have to go back. Before the luxury suits. Before the private jets. Just 6 months ago, Elias was waking up at 4 a.m., the smell of salt and rust etched into his skin. He wasn't just a student. He was a lifeline for his sick mother, working double shifts to keep the lights on. He lived in a world where $100 was the difference between a meal and a fast. Meanwhile, Julian Sterling lived in a world where 100 million was a rounding error. But Julian had a secret. His empire was built on a lie that started with the destruction of Elias's father years ago. Elias didn't choose this institute for the prestige. He chose it for revenge. He spent his nights studying by the light of a flickering bulb, mastering the very algorithms Sterling used to crush his family. Every insult Julian hurled in class, every time he called Elias a charity case or a mistake, it was just fuel for the fire. Elias wasn't just a math prodigy. He was a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Back in the lecture hall, the clock hits 1 o'clock. 1 minute left. The wealthy students are snickering. They're recording on their gold-plated iPhones, waiting for the poor kid to break. Julian is already reaching for the expulsion papers. He thinks this is the end of Elias Vance. What he doesn't know is that the equation on the board isn't just a math problem. It's the master key to Julian's entire financial network. And Elias is about to turn it. What you're about to discover in this story will change the way you think about success, power, and the true cost of a soul. Because in the next few minutes, the world of the 1% is going to come crashing down, all because they underestimated the boy with nothing to lose. Before we begin this incredible journey, welcome to the channel. I want to be honest with you. This video took good hours to research, enough hours to write, and quality hours to produce. Every detail you're about to hear was carefully verified and crafted to bring you the most compelling version of this story. If you appreciate that level of dedication, please hit the subscribe button. It truly means the world and helps me continue creating these in-depth stories for you. Before we reveal what Elias wrote on that board, have you ever wondered what separates those who build lasting wealth from those who lose everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to that cold Tuesday morning. The clock is at 30 seconds. Elias steps toward the board. The air in the room shifts. The war has officially begun. To understand the explosion that happened in that classroom, you first have to understand the two worlds that were never supposed to collide. Our story begins in the Blackwood shipyards, a place where the air tastes like rust and the sun never seems to quite burn through the fog. This is where Elias Vance spent his mornings. While most 20-year-olds were hitting the snooze button, Elias was clocking in at 4:30 a.m. He wasn't there for a summer job. He was there because, at $14.50 an hour, he was the only thing standing between his mother and the street. Imagine a young man, tall but lean from skipped meals, moving through a maze of steel beams. He carried a notebook in the pocket of his greased-stained coveralls. It wasn't filled with sketches or poems. It was filled with multivariable calculus. To the other workers, Elias was just the kid. They saw him staring at the structural blueprints of massive cargo ships, his lips moving silently. They thought he was daydreaming. He wasn't. He was calculating the stress loads of every weld, finding mistakes the senior engineers had missed. One morning, a foreman named Miller tossed a heavy wrench at Elias's feet. "Stop staring at the sky, Vance. We've got a deadline. That ship leaves for Singapore in 6 hours." Elias picked up the wrench, his eyes moving to the hull. "If you load it the way the manifest says, Miller, the center of gravity will shift 4 degrees to the port side. You'll lose the cargo before you hit the Atlantic." Miller laughed. "Go back to your numbers, kid. Leave the heavy lifting to the men." Elias didn't argue. He couldn't afford to lose the job. But as he watched the ship lurch out of the harbor later that day, he knew he was right. He had a gift that was both a blessing and a curse. He saw the world in its mathematical truth. And the truth was, his world was breaking. Pause. Every evening, Elias would take 2 buses and a train to reach the edge of the city. He'd walk past the gated mansions of the Heights, where the lawns were manicured by people who made more in a day than Elias's father had made in a year. His destination was a small, cramped apartment in a building that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wood. This was where Maya Vance lived. She was a woman who had once been a brilliant concert pianist, but now her hands were gnarled by an aggressive form of autoimmune disease. The medical bills were a mountain. $4,200 a month just for the infusions. Elias would sit by her bed, hiding his bruised knuckles, and tell her stories about the Sterling Institute. He told her about the marble floors and the libraries that smelled like old leather. "You belong there, Elias," she would whisper, her voice like paper. "Your father's blood runs in you. He didn't just build programs. He built futures. Don't let Julian Sterling take that from you too." Elias was sitting in the back of the Sterling Institute's library, the smell of expensive parchment and floor wax surrounding him. He was tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones when you've had 4 hours of sleep in 3 days. His phone buzzed on the mahogany table. It was a restricted number. "Mr. Vance." The voice was clinical, cold. "This is St. Jude's billing department. We've reviewed your mother's chart. The new experimental treatment is the only way to halt the progression of her condition. The cost is $45,000, and we need a deposit of $10,000 by Friday, or we have to release her bed." $10,000. To Julian Sterling, that was a dinner for 4 at Massa. To Elias, it was an impossible sum. He felt the walls of the library closing in. He looked at his hands. Grease was still stained under his fingernails from the shipyard shift he'd finished at dawn. He felt a surge of pure, raw desperation. It's the kind of feeling that makes your heart beat in your throat. He wasn't just fighting for an education anymore. He was fighting for his mother's life. He realized in that moment that being the smartest person in the room meant nothing if he couldn't protect the only person who loved him. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. Several students in cashmere sweaters looked up and shushed him. Elias didn't even see them. He saw the fire. He saw the path forward. He walked straight to Professor Julian Sterling's private office. The door was heavy oak, emblazoned with a silver plaque. Elias didn't knock. He pushed it open. Julian was sitting behind a glass desk, staring at a monitor filled with cascading red numbers. He looked up, his eyes cold and unimpressed. "Mr. Vance, I don't recall inviting you to my inner sanctum. I assume you're here to withdraw." "I need an advance on the Sterling Fellowship grant," Elias said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. "The one for the top student in the department. It's $50,000. Julian laughed, a short, sharp sound like breaking glass. "That grant is awarded at the end of the year, Elias. And it's awarded to someone who contributes to the field. You're a ghost. You haven't turned in a single assignment." "Because your assignments are 20 years behind the curve, Julian," Elias countered. The room went deathly quiet. No one called Julian Sterling by his first name. Julian stood up, smoothing his $8,000 suit. He walked around the desk, leaning against it with a deceptive calm. You think you're special because you can do mental math? Fine. Let's play. I have a problem. A real-world problem. My firm is struggling with a bottleneck in our high-frequency trading algorithm. We call it the Sterling Prime. If you can find the flaw in the logic by next Tuesday's public lecture, I'll give you the grant personally. Out of my own pocket. Elias knew it was a trap. Julian wasn't looking for a solution. He was looking for a way to humiliate Elias in front of the entire institute. He was going to give Elias an unsolvable problem and then crush him when he failed. And if I fail? Elias asked. You leave the institute. You sign a non-compete that says you'll never work in tech or finance again. You go back to the docks, Elias. Permanently. Elias took the flash drive Julian offered. That night, back in his cramped apartment, he plugged it into his beat-up laptop. The screen was filled with thousands of lines of code. Complex, beautiful, and deeply, fundamentally broken. It was his father's work. Julian hadn't just stolen the Oracle Bridge. He had tried to improve it, and in doing so, he had introduced a fatal error. Julian was trying to predict the future using a mirror that only showed the past. For the next 4 days, Elias didn't sleep. He lived on black coffee and the sheer force of his own will. He stopped going to the shipyard, losing his only source of income. He was betting everything on this one play. But he wasn't alone. On the second night, there was a knock on his library cubicle. It was Clara Sterling. She was carrying 2 coffees and a look of intense conflict. My father is a cruel man, Elias, she said softly, sitting across from him. He's obsessed with legacy. He thinks you're a threat to his. I'm just a student, Clara, Elias said, not looking up from the screen. No, you're not. I've seen your notes. You're doing things with numbers that even the AI in our labs can't process. She hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. These are the internal server logs. They show where the algorithm is crashing. My father doesn't know I have them. Elias looked at her. Clara was the heir to the Sterling Empire, yet here she was, betraying her father to help the charity case. Why? He asked. Because I want to see something real for once, she whispered. Everything in my world is bought and paid for. I want to see if genius actually exists. As the days bled together, the romantic tension between them grew. They spent 12 hours a day side by side in the quiet corners of the institute. Clara taught Elias how to navigate the social minefields of the wealthy, and Elias taught Clara that math wasn't just numbers, it was a language of the soul. He saw the loneliness in her. She lived in a palace, but she was a prisoner of her father's expectations. And she saw the fire in him. She saw a man who would move mountains for his mother. But the obstacles were mounting. On Monday, the hospital called again. They were moving his mother to a general ward because the deposit hadn't been paid. Elias felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was so close. He had found the God algorithm's flaw. It wasn't a math error. It was a moral one. Julian's code was designed to profit from market crashes. It actually encouraged them to happen. Elias realized he had a choice. He could fix the code, give Julian the God algorithm, and take the money to save his mom. Or he could write a kill switch into the code, a sequence that would destroy Julian's entire financial network the moment it was activated. Revenge or survival. Tuesday morning arrived. The grand hall of the Sterling Institute was packed. Camera crews from CNBC and Bloomberg were there. The board of directors sat in the front row, their faces grim. Julian Sterling stood on the stage, looking like a king ready for a coronation. He looked at the back of the room and saw Elias walking in. Elias looked like a wreck. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes were wrinkled, but his gaze was like a laser. Julian stepped to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, today we witness the future of finance. But first, let's see if our prodigy can handle the heat. He turned to the chalkboard. Mr. Vance, the stage is yours. You have 5 minutes to solve the Sterling Prime. The clock starts now. The room went silent. The digital clock flickered to life. 5 o'clock. Elias walked down the aisle. Every eye was on him. He felt the weight of his father's memory. He felt the warmth of Clara's hand as she brushed past him in the front row. He felt the cold, hard reality of his mother's hospital bed. He picked up the chalk. His hand didn't shake. He didn't start with the math. He looked Julian Sterling dead in the eye and said, "You didn't write this, Julian. You stole it. And now, I'm going to show everyone what happens when you build a house on someone else's grave." The room gasped. Julian's face turned a deep, furious red. "Solve the equation, boy, or get out." Elias turned to the board. His hand began to move with a speed that didn't seem human. Symbols, variables, and lines of logic began to fill the black surface. It was a symphony of vengeance. The clock was at 2:30. Halfway there. Elias was at a crossroads. He was about to reach the part of the equation where he had to decide: save his mother's life with Julian's blood money, or burn the whole empire down. At this point, Elias had to choose between the $50,000 grant that would save his mother's life immediately, or a kill switch that would bankrupt Julian Sterling but leave Elias with nothing. What would you have done? Would you take the money and run, or would you choose total revenge? This decision would define everything that came next. But what Julian didn't realize was that Elias had found a third option. A secret, hidden within the numbers that even Arthur Vance hadn't seen. And as the clock ticked down to the final 60 seconds, the world was about to find out that when you mock a prodigy, you aren't just hurting a student. You're triggering a revolution. Desperation is a silent predator, and for Elias Vance, it didn't just growl, it bit deep into the bone. As that digital clock in the Sterling Institute ticked down toward the 3-minute mark, the world didn't see the 48 hours of hell Elias had just endured. They saw a kid with a piece of chalk, but they didn't see the man who had been pushed to his absolute limit. 2 days before the confrontation, Elias's world had reached a breaking point. It started at 3:14 a.m. The power in his apartment didn't just flicker. It died. The hum of his mother's oxygen concentrator, a sound he had learned to lean on like a heartbeat, was replaced by a deafening, terrifying silence. Elias had scrambled in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had $14.12 in his bank account. The utility company wanted $840 to restore service. He had been choosing between medicine and electricity for months, and that night the math finally failed him. He had to carry his mother down 3 flights of stairs in the pouring rain. Every step felt like he was carrying the weight of his father's failed dreams. As he sat in the fluorescent, soul-crushing light of the public hospital ER, a nurse told him the truth. "She's stable, Elias, but she can't go back to that apartment. If you can't provide a safe environment, the state has to intervene." In that moment, Elias felt a coldness settle over him that no furnace could touch. He wasn't just a prodigy. He was a son who was failing. He looked at his reflection in the hospital's scratched vending machine glass and saw a ghost. Was he crazy? Was he arrogant to think he could take on a billionaire while he couldn't even keep the lights on? But while Elias was at his lowest, Julian Sterling was descending into a different kind of madness. In a glass-walled boardroom on the 80th floor, Julian was staring at a projected graph that looked like a heart attack. His investors, men who controlled the GDP of small nations, were sitting in high-back leather chairs. "The Oracle Bridge is lagging," Julian once said, his voice like sandpaper. "We've seen a $200 million dip in the overnight trades. If the public demonstration on Tuesday doesn't show a fix, we're pulling our capital. All $4 billion of it." Julian smiled, but his eyes were twitching. He was a man who had built a throne out of other people's ideas, and for the first time, the legs were rotting. He needed Elias's mind, but his ego demanded he destroy the boy first. He was betting his entire empire that Elias would break under the pressure of the impossible equation. Monday morning was the darkest of all. Elias had gone back to the shipyard, begging for an advance on his wages. The foreman, Miller, didn't even look up from his clipboard. "We let you go, kid. You missed 3 shifts. The union rules are clear. There's no money for you here." Elias stood in the mud of the yard, the cold wind whipping his thin hoodie. He was officially unemployed, homeless adjacent, and his mother was a ward of the state. Most people would have quit. Most people would have taken Julian's offer to just walk away and never look back. But Elias had a secret weapon, the notebook. Inside those frayed pages, he had finally cracked the human variable Julian had ignored. He realized that the algorithm Julian stole from his father wasn't failing because of a math error. It was failing because Julian had removed the empathy constant. Julian's code assumed people were rational. Elias knew they were driven by fear, love, and desperation. He understood the market because he understood struggle. He spent that Monday night in a 24-hour laundromat, using their free Wi-Fi and a dying laptop battery. It was there, amidst the smell of bleach and the hum of industrial dryers, that he wrote the final lines of the revenge script. He wasn't just fixing a stock market tool. He was creating a mirror. If Julian activated the code, it would redistribute the stolen wealth of the Sterling Prime back into the accounts of the people Julian had crushed over the decades. It was a digital Robin Hood. But there was a catch. To make it work, Elias had to input the code live, in front of everyone, onto Julian's own secure server. He had to walk into the lion's den with nothing but his brain. We're at a critical moment here. Elias has the power to destroy Julian, but it means he might never get the $50,000 for his mother's private care. Do you think Elias should have used the kill switch immediately to end Julian's career? Or was there another way forward? Share your perspective below. While Elias was prepping for war in a laundromat, Julian was having a celebratory dinner. He was drinking a $3,000 bottle of Bordeaux, laughing with his advisors. The kid won't show, Julian boasted. He's a scholarship brat. He's probably halfway across the state by now, hiding from the shame. But Clara Sterling wasn't laughing. She stood on the balcony of her father's penthouse, looking out at the city. She had spent the last week watching Elias. She had seen him skip meals to buy mother's medicine. She had seen the way his eyes lit up when he solved a problem that had stumped PhDs. She realized that her father wasn't the hero of the story. He was the glitch. She took her phone out and sent a single text to an unknown number. The server bypass is 09-14, Arthur. That's your father's birthday, isn't it? He never changed it. He's that arrogant. Good luck, Elias. Tuesday morning. The day of the lecture. Elias arrived at the institute. He didn't have a suit. He hadn't showered. He looked like a man who had been through a war, which he had. The security guards tried to stop him at the gate, but Clara was there. He's with me, she said, her voice echoing through the marble foyer. The other students stared. The whispers were like a swarm of bees. Look at him, they said. He smells like a shipyard. He's actually going to try it. Elias walked into the grand hall. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the static of high-definition cameras. He saw Julian on the stage, looking like a god. And he saw the chalkboard, that massive black void waiting to be filled. Julian stepped to the podium. Welcome to the future, he announced to the cameras. Today, we prove that genius is a matter of breeding. Mr. Vance, if you please. The clock started. 5 o'clock. Minute 1 was a blur of chalk dust. Elias wrote with a fury that silenced the room. Minute 2 was when the investors started leaning forward. They realized he wasn't just solving a problem. He was rewriting the foundation of their wealth. Minute 3. That's where we are now. Julian's face had changed from a smirk to a mask of pure terror. He saw the kill switch, hidden in the subequations. He realized that Elias wasn't just fixing the algorithm. He was taking control of the entire Sterling network. Stop, Julian whispered, moving toward Elias. I'll give you the money. 100,000. Just stop writing. Elias didn't even turn around. You're late, Julian. The market is already opening. And your God algorithm is about to meet its maker. The room was in a frenzy. The CNBC reporter was shouting into her microphone. The investors were on their phones, screaming at their brokers. And in the middle of it all, Elias Vance was finishing the final line of a masterpiece that would change the world forever. We're at the midpoint of this incredible story, and the real fallout is about to begin. If you're still here, I genuinely appreciate you. What's kept you engaged so far? Is it the revenge, the romance, or the sheer brilliance of the underdog? Let me know in the comments. But the biggest shock wasn't the money. It wasn't the kill switch. It was what happened when the clock hit 0 and a name appeared on every screen in the room. A name that Julian Sterling thought he had buried 10 years ago. When the clock hit 0, the silence in the grand hall wasn't the end of the story. It was the sound of a $40 billion empire beginning to liquefy. Elias Vance didn't drop the chalk. He laid it down carefully, like a soldier disarming a bomb. On the board behind him was a sequence of numbers that looked like madness to the students, but to the board of directors, it was a death warrant. The screens at the front of the room, usually displaying Julian Sterling's inflated stock prices, began to flicker. Red lines cascaded. But they weren't just falling, they were shifting. The kill switch Elias had coded didn't just delete money. It redistributed the unrealized gains from Julian's predatory trades back into the foundational accounts Julian had drained 10 years prior. In the back of the room, a lead investor's phone shrieked. Then another. Within 60 seconds, the room was a cacophony of ringtones and frantic whispers. Julian Sterling stood frozen. He looked at the board, then at his tablet, then back at Elias. What have you done? Julian's voice was a ragged whisper. You've triggered a sell-off. You've destroyed the fund. No, Julian, Elias said, his voice carrying to the very back of the hall. I just corrected the error. My father's algorithm was designed to stabilize the market. You modified it to cannibalize it. I just put the heart back in the machine. The turning point wasn't just the money. It was the moment Marcus Thorne, the Institute's most powerful trustee and a legendary rival of Julian, stood up. He didn't look at Julian. He walked straight to Elias, looked at the board for a long silent minute, and then extended his hand. Mr. Vance, Thorne said, his voice booming. I haven't seen math that elegant since your father passed. Sterling didn't build this institute. He just rented it. I think it's time for a change in management. The weeks following that day were a blur of transformation. The momentum had shifted with the force of a tidal wave. Thorne didn't just offer Elias a scholarship. He offered him a $25 million seed investment to launch Vance Global Analytics. Elias went from having $14 in his bank account to being the CEO of the most watched startup in the world. But the real success wasn't the office in the glass tower. It was the morning Elias walked into the private wing of the city's top neurological center. He wasn't wearing greased coveralls. He was wearing a simple tailored suit. He walked into room 402. His mother, Maya, was sitting up in a chair, the color returning to her cheeks thanks to the $200,000 treatment that Elias had paid for in full on the day of the lecture. We're going home, Mom, he whispered. A real home. With lights that never go out. While Elias rose, Julian Sterling began a slow, public disintegration. The SEC launched an investigation into the Sterling Prime algorithm. Julian was stripped of his professorship. His penthouse was put on the market. The man who once flew private was now seen taking a taxi to depositions. But this wasn't just a story of revenge. It was a story of redemption. Clara Sterling made a choice that shocked the city. She resigned from her father's firm and joined Elias as his chief operations officer. The romantic tension that had simmered in the library now had room to breathe. They spent late nights not just solving math, but building a company based on transparency. My father hates you, you know, Clara said one evening, looking out over the city from their new office. He thinks you cheated. I didn't cheat, Elias replied, standing beside her. I just remembered the one thing he forgot. People aren't just variables. They're the reason we do the math in the first place. Elias began to use his new influence to change the Sterling Institute from the inside. He established the Arthur Vance Memorial Scholarship, a fund specifically for students from the shipyards and the inner cities. He didn't just give them money. He gave them his time. He'd walk through the halls of the institute, seeing kids who looked exactly like he did 6 months ago. Scared, exhausted, and brilliant. One student, a young girl from the same docks where Elias used to work, approached him. Mr. Vance, she said, clutching a notebook. I found a flaw in the new shipping logistics code. Can you look? Elias smiled. He saw the fire in her eyes. I have 5 minutes, he said, echoing Julian's famous line. but with a warmth that Julian never possessed. "Let's see what you've got." But while Elias had found peace, a shadow was still lurking. Julian Sterling wasn't a man who disappeared quietly. Julian had retreated to a small estate in the Hamptons, the only property the lawyers hadn't seized yet. He was obsessed. He had walls covered in printouts of Elias's code. He was looking for a crack. He was looking for the one thing Elias had missed. Julian was convinced that Elias had left a back door in the new Vance analytics system. He spent his nights drinking expensive scotch and whispering to the empty rooms. He thinks he won. He thinks he's the new king. But every king has an Achilles heel. Julian began reaching out to his old contacts in the dark pool markets, the unregulated, dangerous corners of global finance. He was trading the last of his personal jewelry and hidden offshore accounts for information. He wasn't looking for a comeback. He was looking for a suicide mission. As Elias prepared for the global launch of his new platform, a system that would effectively end predatory high-frequency trading, he felt a sense of completion. He had the wealth, he had the girl, and his mother was finally healthy. He was at a new level of power. He was being invited to speak at the World Economic Forum. He was on the cover of Forbes. But he remained the boy from the shipyard. He still kept his father's old notebook in his desk drawer. The stage was being set for one final revelation. Julian had discovered something. Not a math error, but a legal one. A document hidden in the depths of the original Oracle bridge patents that suggested Elias might not actually own the rights to his own company. Clara saw the change in her father from a distance. She warned Elias. "He's quiet. That's when he's most dangerous. He's going to strike when you're at your highest point. He wants the fall to be as long as possible." Elias looked at the board in his office. It was clean. No impossible equations. Just a clear path forward. "Let him come," Elias said. "The difference between Julian and me is that I know how it feels to have nothing. He's terrified of the dark. I grew up in it." Elias Vance had transformed from a ghost into a titan. He had rebuilt his father's legacy and saved his family. But the ultimate test of his character wasn't his rise. It was how he would handle the man who was determined to drag him back into the mud. At this point, Elias has transformed into someone completely different. He's no longer the victim. He's the one with the power. Do you think people can truly change, or does our core nature stay the same? Will Elias remain the humble prodigy, or will the power of his new empire turn him into exactly what he hated? This is important for what comes next. Because Julian Sterling just found a loophole that could take everything Elias has built in a single day. And the only way for Elias to stop him might involve breaking the very laws he's worked so hard to protect. The final confrontation is coming, and this time, there is no 5-minute clock. There is only the truth. The most dangerous man in the room isn't the one with the loudest voice. It's the one who has already played the final move before the game even started. The grand gala at the Sterling Institute was supposed to be Julian Sterling's funeral, metaphorically speaking. Instead, it was the coronation of Elias Vance. The hall was filled with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne. The world's financial press was there, cameras flashing like a summer lightning storm. Elias stood at the center of the room. He was no longer the boy in the hoodie. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo, his posture straight, his eyes calm. He looked like a man who had finally made peace with his ghosts. But Elias knew Julian was coming. He had tracked the legal filings. He had seen the anonymous queries into his father's original patents. He knew that Julian, in his desperation, had found the shadow clause, a technicality that suggested any derivative work of the Oracle bridge belonged to the original patent holder. Julian thought he still held that title. Beside Elias stood Clara. She was radiant, but her eyes were darting toward the entrance. She knew her father's pride better than anyone. "He's here," she whispered, her hand tightening on Elias's arm. "I can feel the air change." Elias patted her hand. "Let him come, Clara. The truth doesn't need a shield." The heavy oak doors swung open. The room went silent, the kind of silence that precedes a crash. Julian Sterling walked in. He looked like a shadow of his former self. His hair was unkempt, His suit was a season old, and his eyes were bloodshot. But he held a leather portfolio as if it were a holy relic. He didn't wait for an introduction. He marched straight to the stage where Elias stood near the board of trustees. The cameras turned. This was the moment the world had been waiting for. The fallen titan versus the rising prodigy. Julian stopped 5 feet from Elias. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the board. He looked only at the boy who had taken his world. "You think you've won, Mr. Vance?" Julian's voice was thin, trembling with a mix of rage and triumph. "You think you can just walk into my house and take my legacy? You forgot one thing. I own the foundation." According to the 2016 Intellectual Property Act, the Vance Unity platform is a derivative of the Sterling Prime. Everything you've built, the company, the seed money, the patents, it all belongs to me. He slammed the portfolio onto a nearby table. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here for my keys." The board members looked at each other, panicked. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his face grim. "Julian, this is not the time or place." "It is exactly the time." Julian roared. "Look at the filing. Document 44B. My name is on the title." Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the documents. He just looked at Julian with something that felt like pity. "You're right about one thing, Julian," Elias said, his voice amplified by the stage mic so the whole world could hear. "The shadow clause is real. But you should have checked the names on the original transfer of title from 10 years ago." Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a single yellowed piece of paper. It was a document signed by his father, Arthur Vance, just days before he died. "My father knew you were a wolf, Julian. He knew you would try to strip the Oracle Bridge from him. So, he didn't just sign the patents over to you. He signed them over to a trust. A trust that was only accessible upon the completion of a specific mathematical proof. The one you called impossible in that classroom 3 months ago." Elias stepped closer to Julian. "When I solved that equation on your chalkboard, I didn't just humiliate you. I unlocked the legal title to my father's entire life's work. You never owned the Oracle Bridge, Julian. You were just the temporary administrator of a trust that belonged to me the moment I turned 21 and solved the puzzle." The color drained from Julian's face. He stumbled back, his hand searching for a chair that wasn't there. The loophole he thought would save him was actually the final lock on his cage. But there was one more blow. Clara stepped forward. She looked at her father, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I gave him the final keys, Dad. I found the documents you tried to shred, the ones showing you falsified the transfer signatures in 2016. I gave them to the SEC this morning." The room erupted. The flashes from the cameras were blinding now. Julian looked around, seeing only judgment. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He wasn't even a professor. He was just a man who had been outsmarted by the son of the man he killed. The security team didn't have to escort Julian out. He walked out on his own, his head down, the portfolio left forgotten on the table. Outside, the flash of blue and red lights waited. 2 federal agents stepped forward. No handcuffs were needed. Julian was already broken. The Board of Trustees immediately voted to rename the center. It was no longer the Sterling Hall. It was the Arthur Vance Center for Financial Ethics. Elias didn't celebrate. He watched the doors close behind Julian and felt a strange sensation. Nothing. No more anger. No more drive for revenge. The weight he had been carrying since he was 10 years old was simply gone. An hour later, as the gala continued without him, Elias found himself on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. His mother joined him. She was in a wheelchair, wrapped in a pashmina, but she looked stronger than he had ever seen her. She took his hand, the hand that was still stained with a faint trace of white chalk. "You did it, Elias," she whispered. "Not for the money. Not for the fame. You brought your father home." Elias looked at his mother, then at Clara, who was standing in the doorway waiting for him. He realized that the math was finally simple. Wealth isn't what you take. It's what you leave behind. He had started with nothing, worked in the dark, and fought a giant. And in the end, he didn't need to destroy Julian Sterling. Julian had destroyed himself. Elias just provided the proof. The video ends with a shot of the Blackwood shipyards. A new school is being built on the edge of the docks, the Vance Academy. It's a place where kids who see the world in numbers can go to learn, regardless of the grease on their hands or the balance in their bank accounts. Elias Vance is no longer a ghost. He is the bridge. The confrontation is over. Do you feel satisfied with how this played out? Or would you have wanted Elias to do something different? Would you have been more vindictive, or was his quiet victory enough? There's no wrong answer here. Let's talk about it in the comments. This has been the incredible journey of a student who was told he was nothing, only to prove he was everything. Thank you for staying with us for this 1-hour special. If you haven't yet, please consider subscribing for more stories of justice, genius, and the power of the underdog. Until next time, keep solving the impossible. The dust has finally settled, but for Julian Sterling and Elias Vance, the ripples of that 5-minute confrontation are just beginning to change the world. Justice is often described as a blind goddess, but in the case of Julian Sterling, it felt like she was watching with absolute precision. Within 48 hours of the gala, the Sterling Institute's Board of Trustees issued a unanimous vote to strip Julian's name from every building, scholarship, and brick on the campus. But the social execution was nothing compared to the legal one. The SEC investigation, fueled by the evidence Clara provided and the digital trail Elias uncovered, led to an 18-count indictment. Fraud, embezzlement, and the systematic theft of intellectual property. Julian's fall wasn't a quick drop. It was a slow, agonizing slide. His assets were frozen. The $60 million penthouse was seized and auctioned to pay back the thousands of investors he had manipulated. His social circle, the people who once toasted his genius at Davos and the Met Gala, evaporated overnight. Today, Julian Sterling lives in a modest 2-bedroom rental in a city where no one knows his name. He spends his days in courtrooms and his nights staring at a different kind of board, a legal pad where he tries to calculate how he lost it all. He didn't just lose his money, he lost the one thing he valued most, his reputation as the smartest man in the room. While Julian faded into obscurity, Elias Vance's rise became a case study in ethical success. Vance Global Analytics didn't just become a company. It became the new standard for the New York Stock Exchange. Elias didn't stop at fixing the market. He used his first $100 million in personal dividends to establish the Vance Shipyard Initiative. He bought the very docks where he used to work, not to tear them down but to modernize them. He turned the Blackwood shipyards into a carbon-neutral shipping hub, providing high-paying, dignified jobs to the men and women who used to call him the Kid. Recognition followed. Not that Elias sought it. He was named to the Time 100 list, not under titans, but under builders. He was invited back to the Sterling Institute, now the Vance Institute, not as a student, but as the keynote speaker for graduation. He stood at the same podium where Julian once mocked him. This time, the room wasn't filled with arrogant heirs, but with a diverse group of graduates who earned their way there. He looked out at them and didn't see numbers. He saw potential. Elias often reflects on those cold nights in the shipyard and the desperate hours in the hospital waiting room. He realized a profound truth. Julian Sterling's cruelty wasn't a roadblock, it was the forge. If Julian hadn't pushed me, Elias told a journalist recently, I might have settled for being a good engineer. His arrogance forced me to become a visionary. He thought he was breaking me, but he was actually polishing the diamond. He feels no more bitterness. He understands that hardship was the currency he used to buy his current peace. Every calloused finger and every skipped meal was a deposit into the man he is today. And then there is the legacy. Elias and Clara's partnership grew into something deeper than business. They married in a quiet ceremony on the very docks where Elias's father first dreamed of the Oracle Bridge. Their children are now growing up in a world far removed from the shipyard, but they aren't heirs in the way Julian's generation was. They spend their summers working at the Vance Academy, tutoring other kids in math and coding. They view their father not as a billionaire, but as a man of integrity. They know the story of the impossible equation, but they don't see it as a story about math. They see it as a story about the day their father stood up for the truth. They possess a wisdom beyond their years, a groundedness that comes from knowing that wealth is a tool, not a destination. If you walk into the Vance Global headquarters today, you'll find a bronze plaque in the lobby. It doesn't list stock prices. It's a quote from Arthur Vance. A bridge is only as strong as the intent of the person who built it. Elias still wakes up at 4:30 a.m. He doesn't have to, but he likes the quiet. He likes to watch the sun rise over the city, knowing that his mother is sleeping soundly in a home she owns, and that his father's name is finally cleared. Julian Sterling is occasionally spotted in public libraries, using the free computers to check the market he no longer influences. He is the ghost now. The world moved on as it always does. The God algorithm is now a public utility, ensuring that no one man can ever crash the market for a profit again. The underdog didn't just win the fight. He changed the rules of the game. Looking at where everyone ended up, the billionaire in a rental and the shipyard worker in the boardroom. Do you believe in karma? Or is this just the natural, mathematical consequence of the choices they made? I want to hear what you think in the comments below. But the story isn't quite over. Because while Elias has found peace, the world is about to face a new kind of crisis, one that his father predicted in the final pages of that old notebook. A crisis that math alone might not be able to solve. In the end, Elias Vance didn't just solve an impossible equation. He proved that the most valuable thing you can own is a soul that cannot be bought. If there is one thing this journey teaches us, it's that success isn't a destination reached by a private jet. It's a mountain climbed by those who are willing to bleed for what they believe in. We often look at billionaires like Julian Sterling and think their wealth is a shield. We think it makes them smarter, better, or more worthy. But as Elias showed us in that classroom, wealth without character is just a high-definition mask for a hollow center. The real meaning of worth isn't found in your bank balance. It's found in what you do when the lights go out and no one is watching. It's the grit you show when you have $14 in your pocket and a world that wants to see you fail. Elias views the world differently now. He doesn't look back at the shipyard with shame, nor does he look at his boardroom with pride. To him, they are just different rooms in the same house. If you were to ask him for advice today, he wouldn't talk to you about algorithms or venture capital. He'd tell you that your circumstances are just the weather. They change, they storm, and eventually they clear. But your character? Your character is the foundation. Don't build your life on the hope that someone will notice you, Elias often says during his quiet mentorship sessions. Build it so that when they finally do look, they see something that can't be shaken. He's changed, of course. The boy who kept his head down in the back of the lecture hall has become a man who speaks with the weight of experience. But the core, the part of him that loved his mother more than his own comfort, remains untouched. He realized that true success wasn't the moment the money hit his account. It was the moment he could look in the mirror and know he hadn't become the monster he was fighting. He didn't use Julian's tactics to beat Julian. He used excellence. And that is the ultimate victory. Looking at Elias and Clara's children, you see the promise of a broken cycle. They are the first generation of Vances to grow up without the shadow of debt or the fear of a medical bill. But they aren't shielded from the world. Elias makes sure they understand the value of a hard day's work. They know the story of their grandfather, Arthur, not as a tragedy, but as a blueprint. They are being raised with the understanding that their privilege isn't a throne, it's a responsibility. The struggle of their father prepared them by giving them a moral compass that points toward service rather than greed. They are the living proof that generational trauma can be transformed into generational wisdom. As for Julian Sterling, Elias doesn't spend his nights celebrating the man's downfall. There is no triumph in his heart when he hears about Julian's legal battles or his shrunken life. There is only a measured perspective. Elias understands now that Julian was a prisoner long before he ever faced a courtroom. He was a prisoner of his own ego, trapped in a cycle of needing to be more, because he felt like nothing on the inside. Julian's opinion of me used to be my biggest fear, Elias reflected in a recent journal entry. Now, I realize his opinion never mattered. He was a man fighting a ghost, while I was a man building a bridge. Elias has reached a place of total peace with the journey. The antagonist wasn't a villain to be destroyed. He was a catalyst to be outgrown. This story is a mirror for all of us. It asks us, What do you do when you're set up to fail? Do you accept the impossible label, or do you rewrite the math? The universal lesson here is that integrity is the only currency that never devalues. Temporary setbacks, even the ones that feel like the end of the world, are often just the setup for a greater success. You cannot measure your worth by someone else's yardstick. If Elias had listened to Julian, he would still be in the shipyard. If he had measured himself by the Dior coats and Ferraris in the parking lot, he would have stayed small. But he loved himself enough to believe in his own genius. He loved his family enough to fight for a better reality. And he was brave enough to let his transformation happen in the light. We've seen the rise, the fall, and the reconstruction of a legacy. We've seen justice served not through a sword, but through a piece of chalk. But as the final chapter of this journey approaches, there is one final piece of the puzzle to place. It's the question that lingers after every great story ends. Now that the war is won, what happens to the warrior? Elias Vance has reached the summit. But the view from the top has revealed one last truth that he, and all of us, must face before the screen goes black. Looking at where everyone ended up, do you believe in karma? Or is this just the natural consequence of choices? I want to hear what you think in the comments below. Do you feel that Julian's current life is a fair trade for the lives he ruined? We started this journey in a classroom filled with shadows and arrogance, but we end it in the light of a legacy that can never be erased. Over the last 3 hours, we've watched the incredible transformation of Elias Vance. We saw him as a ghost in the Blackwood shipyards, working in the cold to save his mother's life. We watched him endure the public mockery of a billionaire who thought math was a weapon of exclusion rather than a tool for truth. The turning point wasn't just solving that impossible equation on the chalkboard. It was the moment Elias decided that his worth wasn't determined by the person holding the chalk. From the desperate nights in a 24-hour laundromat to the high-stakes legal battle that reclaimed his father's name, Elias proved that genius is nothing without the character to back it up. This story matters because it isn't just about one man's revenge. It's about the universal struggle of the underdog. It's about every time you've been told no, every time you've been looked down upon because of where you came from, and every time you've had to choose between your survival and your soul. Elias's victory is significant because it wasn't won through cruelty. He didn't become Julian Sterling to beat him. He became the man his father always knew he could be. He offered hope to his mother, a future to his children, and a new standard of integrity to the world. What makes this story resonate is the realization that justice doesn't always come from a gavel or a court order. Sometimes, justice is simply the natural consequence of being excellent. Julian Sterling's empire fell because it was built on a foundation of theft and ego. Elias Vance's empire rose because it was built on the service of others and the pursuit of truth. It's a reminder that resilience is the ultimate superpower. When life hits you with a 5-minute clock and an unsolvable problem, you don't panic. You pick up the chalk. You do the work. You trust the math of your own persistence. As you move forward into your own week, I want you to carry Elias's story with you. Apply it to your own struggles. Whether you're fighting for a promotion, a scholarship, or just to keep the lights on for your family, remember that your current circumstances are not your final destination. You are not the charity case. You are not the mistake. You are the prodigy of your own life. Your value isn't measured by the logo on your clothes or the zeros in your bank account. It is measured by the strength of your character and the depth of your love. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something valuable about resilience and success, please leave a like and share your biggest takeaway in the comments. I read every single one, and your insights make this community special. Did you relate more to the shipyard or the boardroom? Let's keep the conversation going. Remember, you are not defined by what others think of you. You are defined by how you respond when life tests you. Elias Vance proved that the best response to cruelty isn't revenge. It's building a life so beautiful that your critics become irrelevant. Until next time, stay strong, stay focused, and never let anyone convince you that you're nothing. You're everything you choose to become. I am the Story Keeper. Thanks, and I love you all.